So in many ways, we get closer to the present and focus on contemporary authoritarianism in Thailand. So as you know now, while most of my previous work has been an ethnographic engagement with processes of mobility and mobilization, movement and stoppages, in the last years, much of my time has been dedicated to bringing an ethnographic eye to engage with questions traditionally associated with political theory and political sciences. So the idea for today is to focus on the last few years of Thai political development and reflect on what the conversation with study of fascism can teach us about the rise of illiberal middle classing, the crumbled teleology narrative about democratization processes, and the emergences of new form of authoritarianism in Thailand and more generally in Southeast Asia. So first, let me give you a sense of why my work moved in that direction. So why did I go from political social movement and mobilization to authoritarianism? So on May 22nd, 2014, the Royal Thai Army staged the 12th successful military coup in the country since the formal end of the absolute monarchy in 1932. So Thailand is the country in the world with the highest amount of military coup in the last century. Allegedly, the military intervened to put an end of 7 months of another political protest, kind of the opposite side of the political protest that we talked about. Protest we talked about was called the red shirts. They're normally identified as the yellow shirt, which are very conservative forces. 7 months of political turmoil that began when the PDRC, which is the English acronym for this organization, which is called the People Committee for Absolute Absolute Democracy, with the king as the head of state. And we'll get a sense later of what this absolute democracy means. Occupies three key street intersection, the same places that the red shirt occupy, and block government offices in Bangkok. The conservative mobilization demanded the deposition of the elected Thai prime minister at the time, which was the sister of Thaksin that we talked about, and a complete dismissal of what they called the Thaksin system, a network that, according to them, had dominated electoral politics in the previous 13 years through corruption and vote buying. So the accusation was this is a corrupted government that has been running elections that are not fair, and that it's a populist government that we'll see, stupid people vote for. So to fight this, the PDRC demanded a deep constitutional reform before the next election could be held. The military responded to this challenge in 2014 by taking power. At first, the coup looked like a repetition of many military interventions, including the one that removed Thaksin that we talked about in 2006. Then the coup entailed a short-lived military junta, followed by the appointment of an interim government run by a respected figure, kind of like governo tecnico in Italian speaking. The next step then, and on many other coups before, had been a new constitution giving more power to check and balances to control electoral government. So the judiciary in particular had grown a lot from there. And finally, in 2006, elections were held in a year or so after the military coup. So following this script, the discussion in 2014 quickly moved to whom the new prime minister would be, what the new constitution might look like, and behind closed doors, what the role of the monarchy had been in this military coup, and how this was affecting what was the soon-to-be succession. So the older king, called Bhumibol, was very old by the time, and there was a sense that he would die soon, so there was also a question of who would succeed him. The sensation of déjà vu in 2014 of the 2006 coup, however, was very short-lived. Soon after the coup, Prayut Chan-o-cha, which you see here, the army commander-in-chief, made clear that this time the military were there to stay. Heavy repression, centralization of power, and royal silence reflected a radical difference from the army behavior in the previous decades. Yet the military did not stop there. In 2017, the military junta passed a new constitution, drafted and ratified by a parliament that was fully appointed by the coup leader, which established, and is still the constitution of Thailand today, which established basically a parliament composed by 500 people, who was the lower house, kind of like the Camera in Italian, who were elected, and the Senate was not elected, but appointed by the military themselves, composed of 250 people. So you have 500 people elected, 250 not elected. So in other words, what this meant was that a party close to the monarchy and the army would only need to obtain 25% of a vote in order to be able to have a parliamentary majority, while an opposition power had to win election by 75%, which basically no party has ever done in history. So after passing the constitution, Prayut called, obviously, election in March of 2019, in which he ran with his newly formed party called Palang Pracharat, which is kind of like the power of the people. Even in this uneven playing field, ahead of the election, many doubted that Prayut would be able to obtain the necessary support and predicted a split result, meaning they predicted that he would be able to get the majority in parliament to elect himself as a prime minister, but not a majority large enough to actually pass law. For those hoping this result, however, the March election came as a strange surprise. Against most prediction, the party obtained more than 8 million votes, so about 25% of the vote, and in this strange electoral system that the constitution devised, translated in 116 out of 500 non-assigned seats. So when you add them up, they were able to have a parliamentary majority and run the country since, basically. So Prayut, who has risen to power with tanks and military force, now could claim an electoral victory, which he used retroactively to justify the coup, right? So it was like, I won election, therefore the coup was a legitimate coup. So to confirm the impression that this election would not mark the return to democratic politics, Prayut was sworn into his new job on July 16, 2019, and decided to omit a central piece of the constitutional oath that normally elected government have to pronounce. So according to section 161 of the Thai constitution, this oath should have been, I swear I will be loyal to his majesty and perform my duty honestly for the benefit of the country and the people. I will also uphold and comply with the constitution of the kingdom in every aspect. Prayut left out the second part of this and replaced it with the word forever, de facto swearing alliance only to the king but not to the people of Thailand. While the opposition tried to use this to invalidate his premiership without being able to, the voters who supported Prayut, mostly from central Thailand and middle-class voters, seems untroubled by this disregard of democratic procedure. At first glance, this is not surprising, right? These are people who voted for him, so they knew what they were going for, right? However, what was particularly striking for me is that many of these voters were the same people who 2 decades ago, so in the 1990s, took the street to remove a similarly elected military leader and open the era of democratization in Thailand, right? These were the middle classes that everybody thought they are the basis of democracy and democratization. So when seen under this light, the 2019 election pushed me to start exploring one main question. Why is it that the same middle classes who demonstrated, struggle, and campaigned for democratization in the 1990s are now supporting an authoritarian regime and accepting this kind of disregard for constitutionalism? Right? So part of what changed in my work is that I start spending a lot of time talking to like urban middle class family instead of the people from the province I was used to. So today, I try to address this question by exploring the emergence of a new type of authoritarianism in Thailand, one that does not survive against the will of the middle classes, but rather with their support, one that does not live outside constitutionalism or rule of law, but rather inside of it, in fact, created a certain rule of law that fits into this system, and one that is not a temporary, I think, and destined to fail diversion from democratic transition, but rather proposes a completely alternative system of governance that is present in Thailand but also spreading throughout the region. So while the label fascism might seem a little bit imposing and ahistorical to understand this new form of authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, my argument is that our analysis of contemporary authoritarianism in Thailand and beyond can be sharpened actually by putting in conversation with both contemporary and historical discussion of fascism, both in the global south and in the global north. So for this reason, in the first half of this talk, I will mostly reconstruct some of this debate in traditional history of fascism, offering a specific take on them that will get it into a monument, before turning back to Thailand and giving you a conjunctural and ideological analysis of why these middle classes kind of shifted, in the hope that this will give you a sense of why these debates, I think, are important to the study of non-European authoritarianism. So now, as you know, since the election of Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, Duterte in the Philippines, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Donald Trump in the United States, you keep going, many political commentators have increasingly started to use the concept of fascism and of a new fascist era to capture the rise of this right-wing kind of illiberal authoritarianism across the globe. This push, often part of a political strategy, right? Like there's a reason why there's use in fascism, was met, I would say, with very opposite reaction. On the one hand, you have activists and academics, both in and inside Europe, who have been quite reluctant to use this term for a variety of reasons. First, some scholars have cautioned against an ahistorical use of the label of fascism outside the interwar, like between First War and Second World War period. Secondly, others have pointed out that it can be easily instrumentalized, this terminology. And finally, a third group expressed a refusal to transfer this term outside Europe, especially to countries in the global south, right? So there was like an ahistorical argument, an instrumentalization argument, and a geography argument, right? So that's the kind of three main critique. On the other hand, a number of scholars advocated for the opposite and adopted the term tactically to emphasize that the global and international nature of fascism itself, both historical and contemporary. For them, and these are mostly scholars from the global south, using this term challenge what they see as the Eurocentrism common in fascist studies, and highlights the global proliferation of fascist formation outside the United States and Europe since the time of the Cold War and in the contemporary moment. So while these two reactions might seem diametrically opposed, they both, I would argue, start from the idea that Nazism and fascism, at least in their historical formation, were interwar phenomena that took a hold in the European context. While this may seem a self-evident starting point, I here follow a third line of analysis that starts by questioning this apparent obvious historical fact, and in so doing open up an alternative route toward the analysis of contemporary non-European fascism beyond this diffusionist model. Like, so these two models both have the idea that it happened in Europe at a certain point and then is spreading out later. One of the first people to sketch out this third view was Aimé Césaire, a poet and political essay for Martinique. In his 1955 discourse on colonialism, Césaire proposed an innovative take on Nazism, which is rarely used in Europe by European scholars, but very often essential to contemporary reflection of fascism from the global south. After having analyzed the effect of colonialism on the colonial subject in this book, Césaire moves to show how colonialism, and I quote here, decivilized the colonizer and brutalized the colonizer. And in so doing, he frames Nazism not as a European historical phenomenon, but rather, as he called it, as a boomerang effect, which is a term that then Foucault picked up later on to talk about how French violence in Algeria was organizing kind of the treatment in the banlieue. And so there's a lot of writing now about this boomerang effect. It's a concept that came from Aimé Césaire. Europeans, Césaire argued, and I quote here, tolerated Nazism before it was inflicted on them. They absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been only applied to non-European people. Hitler, for him, and I quote again, applied to Europe the colonial procedure which until then had been reserved exclusively to Arabs in Algeria, the Kuli in India, and the blacks of Africa. End quote. In other words, Césaire saw fascism as the epiphenomenon of the logic of colonization, not a phenomenon located in Europe during this period, but rather the coming on of a logic that was well tried and applied in the colonies. While this was mostly a moralistic and psychological argument, the same argument that you find then in Frantz Fanon or in Hannah Arendt, this kind of moralistic idea of a certain type of behavior, The historian David Pizzo, writing about neo-fascism in the Global South in the early 2000s, points out that the colonial origin of fascism are much more profound and concrete. And here's a long quote from him. An often overlooked fact, Pizzo shows, is that fascism owed large debt to ideologies, techniques, and technology formulated and developed in a colonized country. And as a result of an often open resistance the colonizer faced led directly to the development of all sorts of features that later observers would view as quintessentially fascist. The history of biological racism and various extermination ideologies is profoundly marked by the colonial experience, obviously. But also the historical development of the machine gun, air bombardment, doctrine of eradicated indigenous resistance, method of population control and surveillance, and bureaucratic structures must be, and this is again a quote from him, sought not only in Paris or Berlin, but also in the thousands of battlefields in the colonies and in the countless daily context between rulers and ruled. Many of the racial experts, he tells us, who draft the Nazi Nuremberg Law of 1935, the racial law, what we call the racial law, had developed their expertise in German Western Africa, which they kind of came up with the same logic of racial law. Even the concentration camp, perhaps the quintessential symbol of fascist rule, originated in Spanish Cuba. Then it was making its way to the American Philippines and was more fully developed in the Boer War, end quote. So this line of analysis, if we take it a little bit seriously, would both move backward the clock in time of the emergence of fascism to the colonial period and also expand the geography in which historical fascism can be located, in which it was experimented and where it can reappear today. Of course, this does not mean denying that fascism in its most complete form emerged in Italy and in Germany during the interwar period, but rather, as Quentin O'Hare argued, accepting that fascism is not the specter lurking behind any and every manifestation of conservatism or a general latent potentiality of capitalism. Nor it is, he says, a unique, unrepeatable moment of atavism in the moral biography of humankind. It is both and less than more than this. Fascism is an historical phenomenon with a delimited but determined possibility of recurrence, which are proper of history itself, he says. So in other words, this means accepting that we need to talk about fascisms, first of all, in the plural, and do the work of extracting the characteristics that connect all of these different historical recurrences, while also developing a conjunctural analysis that shows its own specificity in each of these cases. Of course, as an anthropologist, the first part of the project is not my area of expertise, and many others have done this work of trying to kind of extract what are the defining element of fascism. However, if this work of distilling this evidence of what Umberto Eco called the eternal fascism or Ur-fascism, like fascism outside of history in a way, is not what we do, reconstructing the specific conjunctural history and ideological formation of specific form of authoritarianism, and then looking at them in relation to those general features is well within our scopes and is what I will do for the rest of the talk. Taking this route, however, does not mean abandoning established tradition in the study of European fascism, but rather, I think, looking at them in order to learn what to do and how to approach this type of analysis. So let me try to do this first before I move back to Thailand and develop this kind of specific context investigation. In the Italian context, I think we can individuate three main conventional models of analysis and interpretation of fascism. And these are historical fascism, right? So even at the moment. The first, some of you know this, might be repetitive, but for those who are not familiar, the first is the interpretation that was proposed by Benedetto Croce and followed by many among liberal and Catholic historians, even in the present. And in this view, fascism is understood as a parenthesis. It's a moral sickness, right? So the argument is this, that this historian have is that fascism was a product of a specific configuration of the First World War and of a crisis of Marxism, And they believed that the real nature could be encapsulated in this description of its phenomenon. Croce family said when he was asked what was fascism, he replied, people who march in a queer way and who said voi instead of lei. This was his definition. In this tradition, fascism was a very contextual and limited phase, a specific historical moment and an exception rather than a tendency, right? So the idea is that it was a moment, it was just that, it's an exception, it's gone. Obviously, in contemporary Italy, when you hear people say, oh, you cannot use the word fascism anymore because it's people who normally tend to think about fascism in this way. The second interpretation, also that thinks as an exception, was famously voiced at the time by Piero Gobetti, and it sees fascism as a revelation of the structural weakness of Italian society and a larger crisis of capitalism. This type of analysis of fascism, which is very, very similar to the one that actually the Comintern under Stalin took, so the idea that fascism was an epiphenomenon that didn't matter. What was at stake was the actual change in form of capitalism, or as Turati called it, fascism was an enormous waste of time, right? So the idea is that they basically underestimated the independent significance of this phenomenon. It was just an effect. What connected these two interpretations was a refusal to see fascism as an historical tendency, to locate it inside this longer history of colonialism, and to pay attention both to its structural condition and its conjunctural history. This is where the third tradition comes in, originally found in Gramsci's Prison Notebook. Directly reconstructed the crisis of the Italian liberal bourgeois government, the concrete study of class alliances and historical bloc, and the formation of fascist hegemony. This view sees fascism mostly as a counter-revolutionary force, like a passive revolution, driven by an alliance between ruling classes and petty bourgeois during a time of crisis. As Terry Eglinton, himself part of this tradition, has pointed out, and I quote here, fascism typically emerged to resolve a situation in which no single class or fraction of a class within the ruling bloc is capable of assuming hegemony. A cohering and mediating force is therefore needed to weld those factions together. Its historical mission, therefore, is to unify the hegemonic bloc. Politically, he continues, fascism originated neither in the boardroom nor in the factory floor, but among the ranks of the petty bourgeois. So the point here is that exploring fascism means reconstructing these conjunctural sociologies, exploring the crisis to which it responds, its hegemonic discourse, and paying a particular attention to the mobilization of what they call the petit bourgeois, their rage and nostalgia, and the acceptance of a degree of political expropriation in order to recuperate something that gets constructed as a social and economic order under threat. So while this mode of analysis would develop in the context of European historical fascism, and therefore has a lot of language of class that I think is a little bit clunky when we read it today, I think we can apply some of its insight to the analysis of authoritarianism in the global south. In an essential debate on the validity of this label of fascism, David Pizzo again argued the European middle class in the interwar period, and I quote here again, uneasily straddled between two worlds, a dynamic industrial one and an older agrarian ancient regime. It was precisely this crisis of modernization, that is to say, the violent dislocation and impoverishment suffered by lower middle classes in Germany and Italy, he argued, that created the popular base that basically right-wing forces cultivated as a counterweight to the forces of the left. The lower middle classes and working classes in the industrializing semi-periphery of the Third War, he prophesized in the 2000s, so again, it's the 2000s, so he's using terms like Third World or semi-periphery, terms that we wouldn't necessarily work today. But he says they are already facing a dire situation or a similar situation with continued globalization. That continued globalization can exacerbate. In the event of a major crisis, he argued, it is precisely this social milieu, practically abandoned by the left, that will prove fertile soil for a new fascist drive, right? So in many ways, I think this type of analysis set the stage for what I was describing at the beginning, a certain historical moment, a political and economic crisis. So this observation provided for me a path to answer the question I started with. So following this lead, let me move back to Thailand and give you a sense first of what crisis this authoritarian term was reacting to and how historical bloc rearranged in the last 10 years around this new military government, before moving to the political ideology and the myths that shapes this term. So up until 2006, Thailand was widely considered one of the most stable democracies in Southeast Asia. This system, this kind of stable democracy, had developed in the 1990s and early 2000s around a specific arrangement of class, ideology, and administrative structure, what that resonated with traditional democratization theory. I don't know how many of you are familiar. If you are, I'm just going to give you a sense. If you're not, that's fine too. So this theory centered around the idea that the middle classes are the bedrock of democracy, and that the expansion of the middle classes will create more democratic participation, right? This is what you hear often in contemporary, and here as not happening in contemporary analysis of China. The idea is like, okay, they'll grow economically, they'll grow a middle class, and this middle class would push for representation, therefore pushing toward democratic turn, which is not happening at all. Before 2005, Thailand seemed to fit this narrative. The middle class was indeed pushing, as a result of this economic growth of the 90s, for new form of political participation, and in so doing reforming state administration and ideology. This alignment, however, started to break apart in 2006. Allegedly liberal middle classes were now supporting a military intervention that removed an elected prime minister, according to their own words, in order to protect democracy. So the PDRC mobilization that we started with, and that paved the way for the 2014 coup, moved a step forward and demanding to reform the administrative apparatus of the state, as they did with the constitution, away from one person, one vote electoral system, revealed the complete undoing of this alignment. Tirayut Bunmi, which is a scholar and an iconic figure of students' mobilization in the 1973 and then of the pro-democracy mobilization of the 1990s, and now became a PDRC supporter, as many of the people who were active in the 70s and the 90s, was voiced what I thought was one of the most striking formulation of this new shape. Speaking to The Nation, a middle-class newspaper, was editorial line along the last 20 years that kind of shifted with its reader from being pro-democracy to be pro-military, he declared, and I quote here, "Those who voted for Yingluck Shinawatra, which is the sister of Thaksin, have forfeited their right by accepting a corrupt and dictatorial government, which would have to be removed by a people's revolution." Unquote. So echoing the discourse of the PDRC supporter, he argued that participation in the administration of the country is in fact a right reserved to citizens who vote the right government, according to the will of this people revolution. A political force here defined not by majority rule, but by the moral standing of its representative. And this language of morality will keep coming back, and so I'll analyze a little bit for you. So the backpedaling of large portion of the Thai middle classes away from electoral democracy under the umbrella of the PRC had been analyzed quite extensively. More recently, a report from the Asia Foundation compared the profile of the red shirts that we talked about before and the PRC protesters, and showed the close relation between Thai middle class and anti-electoral democracy mobilization. So while age and gender are quite similar between the two movements, the report revealed middle class income, education level, and professional path at the PDRC core. Even Fukuyama, which was one of the proposers of democratization theory, had called this idea of democratization theory the end of history, his most famous book is called The End of History, recently came around to argue, and I quote here, the middle class people do not necessarily support democracy in principle. Like everybody else, they want to protect their property and position. In countries like China and Thailand, and that's his quote again, many middle-class people felt threatened by the redistributive demand of the poor and hence have lined up to support authoritarian government. So this matter-of-fact observation, which is basically a recanting of his entire theory, just in passing, became, however, quite prophetic in Thailand. Thai middle class, faced with this emergence of regional and diverse electorate and the movement that we discussed at the beginning, that could decide the election and direct resources away from them, as they had done in what we discussed about the first week, shifted their alliance away from these popular masses to a royal and military elite that proposed less democratic and participative form of government. The authoritarianism proposed by Prayut, in this sense, promised them the predictability of a moral system and the protection of the monarchy, without having to introduce this electoral annoyance, as many of them talk about it. This, for an entrenched middle class that is so detached from the rest of the country to the point that they live basically in air-conditioned rooms everywhere 8 degrees lower than everybody else. So there's like a very, very strong division between the two groups, offer an attractive alternative to the redistributive push that emerged from both electoral politics and social movement that we discussed before. No problem. So basically, it is precisely this new alliance that is allowing Prayut here to roll out some of the large reform that they are transforming the Thai body politics in this dictatorial, and you see the image and the imaginary behind me, chauvinistic and paranoid governance that is based on this idea of a remystification of state ideology, which is typical, I think, of fascist movement and in general counter-revolutionary moment. So I will go and talk from now on to the demystification, but before, let me recapitulate for a moment what we've done so far. So far I gave you, or I tried to give you, a sense of how this process of middle-class shifting occurred and suggests some similarity with the context of the rise of historical fascism in Europe. However, a question remains: how did this counter-revolution become appealing to this middle class, right? Like, how do they get kind of built into this new hegemonic discourse? Here, the long tradition of analyzing this remystification of policies under fascism can be of great help, I think, especially the work of Furo Jesi on the role of myths and mythological machines in historical fascism. So in his analysis of cultures of the rights, Jesi centered on the performative and mobilizing function in historical fascism and after of what he calls the mythological machine, which he sees as a socio-cultural dispositif that institutionalizes and produces meaning, belonging, and identity. In this sense, the political myth, so central to fascist ideology, according to him, offers a cognitive shortcuts, is able to provide an easy orientation in the face of a complex situation, right? So the idea for him is that there are this narrative, they operate as mythological machine, so they create explanation, simple explanation for complex processes. And in so doing, according to him, they create in people this illusion to understand and therefore relieve people from the work of interpreting the present, right? So you could think about the scapegoating of migrants as being one of these mythological machines, right? The ability to have a simple explanation for complex processes and to think that you have this illusion of understanding, according to him. So learning from this analysis, my attention for the rest of the time I have will be directed to reconstruct what those myths are in contemporary Thai authoritarianism. In particular, I focus on three foundational myths, I think. Ultra-royalism, anti-corruption, this language of corruption mobilized by the right, as you see also in Trump calling, during the 2 elections ago, calling the Hillary Clinton corrupt constantly, but what did he mean? It's also very common in contemporary India. Modi used the language of corruption quite a lot. And this idea of good governance or moral governance that kept coming back in what I talked about until now. So let me start from the first one. Royalist ideology has been a characteristic of the Thai states and kind of missing in the conversation we had so far, since its creation in the 1930s, basically, but underwent a significant transformation after the 1980s. So during this period, the king was presented, actually for the first time in a century, as a sacred, popular and democratic ruler, a divine protector for its masses and the father of the nation. It was in the 1990s, however, that this form of neo-royalist ideology really gained momentum. In particular, the king intervened in 1992 to put an end to a violent political struggle between pro-democracy forces and the army. And neo-royalism solidified around this image of a benevolent king who intervened when there was social conflict and somehow became an icon of democracy. So already you had this kind of middle class relation with the king as a protector of democracy developing in the 90s. On this ground, as the country became more globalized and cosmopolitan and the economic crisis of 1997 happened, the monarch increasingly embodied the nation, almost to counterbalance this collective anxiety about vanishing national identity and increasing consumerism. So in the 90s, you have this giant production by thinker, Buddhist monk, philosopher, like everyday kind of political commentator on this idea that globalization would destroy entire identity. So there was this kind of anxiety about kindness that got like kind of played out. The 1997 economic crisis played a central role, of course, in this process. After the crash, the king gave a very famous speech in which he criticized the country model of growth and introduced this idea of what he called sufficiency economy that I've written a lot about, which is basically a Buddhist-inspired traditional economies of moderation and self-reliance. It was basically the king saying you should be happy with what you have, right? And it was a type of critique of capitalism, very conservative critique of capitalism, that was picked up actually by a lot of international organizations. The UN started writing about it quite a lot in the late 90s. In a similar way of like the happiness index in Bhutan. I don't know if many of you are familiar. And I've written a lot about how this is played out and what kind of conservative forces are built into it. This discourse, more than any real economic policy, came to dominate conservative ideology since then and confirmed this vision of the king as the upholder of kindness, a wise fighter for the nation. Particularly since then, the figure of Bhumipol, which was the king at the time, underwent an unprecedented remystification as the Dhammaraja. So this is a concept, a very old Buddhist concept of a Buddhist king who could be a Buddha and decides to not reach alignment to rule. And it was a concept that was not used for 150 years and was picked up again and readopted starting from the late 80s, beginning of the 90s. In 2003, to sustain this refactioning of the king, the Ministry of Culture was created as a royalist propaganda machine, and its effect could be noticed everywhere, from cinema, street sign, new holidays, to the reintroduction of ritual of loyalty to the monarchy in universities, and the rise of royal family trendsetter and influencer and stuff like that. So what it means, just to give you an example of what it means, starting in the mid-2000s, if you go to the cinema to watch a movie, at the beginning of each movie, there is a 1 minute long short movie documentary about the king, and everybody has to race. So you have to all stand up and watch this. And people who weren't stand up were sent to jail and accused of lèse majesty, which is each account is 3 to 15 years of jail. So there were many people who were sent to jail. And of course, there were many people who basically only entered the cinema when the movie already started to not do that. But this was something that entered into the life of people in a way that wasn't there, like image of the king everywhere, calendars with the king face, in restaurant king image. It was this kind of like real proliferation of this remystification of the figure of the king. So for instance, to give you an example, I was working in an archive at some point and I was reading 1920s articles, which was before the absolute monarchy ended. So I was expected that there would be no critique of the king like it was in the 2000s when I started doing research. And it wasn't. In the 1920s, under absolute monarchy, they were like cartoon mocking the king. Stuff that in Thailand, when I started doing work in the early 2000s, would get you in jail for 20 years. So there was this real change in how people interact with it. While few critical voices dare to condemn publicly this radicalization of royal ideology, anti-Thaksin mobilization in 2006 coupled this emerging ideological force with this middle class pushback against the growing power of the elected prime minister. Until then, as I was saying, royalism and democratic development had gone hand in hand, at least according to this orthodox Thai historiography and textbook. Around the mid-2000s, the two ideologies start to move apart. Faced by a fading monarch and the growing power of democratically elected government, a large portion of the Thai middle classes castled around the monarchy. So filled with this anxiety, neo-royalism morphed into what some Thai scholars call ultra-royalism, and put the protection of this sacred monarchy above the preservation of the country democracy. So large section of the Thai middle classes follow this shift and move away from supporting democratic electoralism, which has been central to their mobilization in the 1990s. On one side, many accused at the time Thaksin of being himself anti-royalist and a secret Republican. On the other, they requested the royal intervention, this time not to remove an illegitimate military dictator, but a legally elected one, yet in their view corrupt. The 2006 coup that ensued was not shy of this reference to protecting the monarchy as the major reason behind the military intervention, the same thing that the guy did in 2014. We intervened to protect the monarchy. As a result, ultra-royalism moved from the realm of this national and individual ideology to an organized principle for political mobilization and state administration. The Constitution solidified this new configuration by enshrining royal sufficiency economy as a central economic principle to the nation, which nobody knows what that actually means, but it's just written there. But it was used as a mode to reduce the power of elected politicians. So the idea was elected politicians are pushing us toward the growth-based economy, and the monarch is pushing us to the sufficiency economy, and this is the road we need to follow. So the military junta that produced this document effectively decoupled royalism and democracy, providing groundwork for the unmaking of this democratic administration that is being carried out in the name of royalism and anti-corruption. The opposition between the monarchy, understood as this holden of morality and the center of the nation, and elected politician, presented as intrinsically corrupt, has been central to contemporary discourse throughout modern Thai history. This is a discourse that developed, in fact, in the period of historical fascism, under the rule of this prime minister called Pibun Songkran, who actually was an ally of the Axis. So in the 1939, 1940, 1941, Thailand was not formally in the Second World War, but Pibun was allying with Nazism and fascism, and was trying to introduce some of these dynamics. So very famously, Pibun had a bust of Mussolini in his house. And one of the discourse was this development of the idea of Thai-style democracy. So the idea that democracy was a Western concept that would not work in Thailand, so you had to add some other form of local democracy, and that elected politician represented this kind of attack to nationalist value. However, in the last decades, this understanding of corruption among Thai middle classes underwent a very radical transformation. As a result, I think corruption was no longer just about the misusing of public office for private gain, what we normally consider as corruption in politics, but also about this idea of an immoral and unpatriotic behavior disloyal to the monarchy. This transformed corruption from an issue of governance to an issue of morality, nationalism, and royalism. In this view, elections themselves could be a corrupt practice, even if they're formally, technically okay election. They can be corrupt if the politician oppose the monarchy, because they oppose the center of morality. So in this sense, you can win popular support, but you will still be considered corrupt unless you create what they call good governance. And this idea of good governance is very central, I think, to understand what is happening here. Also, I've written quite a lot about how good governance as a concept entered into Thailand. So this idea, in fact, became the third pillar to this new ideological landscape of anti-democratic forces. And good governance got there through a very, very strange trajectory, because the language of good governance entered the country after the 1997 crisis, pushed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, right? So it came in, as in many other places around the world, after an economic crisis to say you need to go toward good governance, and good governance was understood as a technocratic concept, so a certain type of governance, which also include a collaboration with the private sector, but it was a very kind of technocratic idea. In Thailand, however, the concept was translated by conservative political ideologues by using the word of Dhamma. So I've written quite a lot about this process of translation, because in Thailand there's this very interesting phenomenon when a new word arrives, they have an actual institution who decide how it's translated into Thai. And so you can have access to the archive of the debate that they have about what word to use. And in this case, they transform good governance in Dhamma Pibat, and Pibat is governance. Dhamma is like the rule of the universe, right? So it's what it was a technical idea of good governance in a technical term became moral governance in this Buddhist sense. And remember, the king was reframed as the Dhammaraja, so the holder of the Dhamma. So good governance became royalist governance somehow in this process of translation. And there's a long, long tradition, especially during colonial time, of Thai conservative thinking about how you could use translation to slow down historical transformation. And they've written actually themselves a lot about this. So as a consequence, it became this moral governance rather than a technocratic one. Governance of the Dhamma, which was necessarily connected, as I was saying, to the moral authority of the king, the Dhammaraja. So just to give you a sense of the significance of this shift, in the preamble of the 2017 Constitution, the one I was saying that was written by the military, this preamble declared that this new document and the coup that preceded it was necessary, and I quote here, so to establish strict and absolute mechanism to prevent, examine, and eliminate dishonest act and wrongful conduct, to prevent executive who lack moral virtue, ethics, and good governance from ruling the country and using power arbitrarily. This idea that the moral virtue, ethics, and good governance can become grounds to justify military coup and free its perpetrator from legal and political accountability, mixed with this historical distrust and dismissal of regional and poor voters as unable to resist handouts and to decide what is best for them, has come to dominate the ideology of these supporters. Through this lens, the anti-Thaksin middle classes could preserve their own representation as holder of true democracy, or what the PDSC call absolute democracy, which is the system that relies on good people who prioritize the fight against corruption and the protection of the monarchy over obtaining electoral success. As a result, a large share of these middle classes shifted alliance away from the electoral masses to support this military elite. So since the 2014 coup, Prayut has solidified this convergence by endorsing these three pillars of ultra-royalism, anti-corruption, and moral governance. On the one hand, as military takeover has historically done, he has held that the coup was staged to defend the monarchy, as I was saying, and wage an unprecedented war on anybody who dares to criticize the institution. So this lèse majesty law use really skyrocketed since then. On the other, like many coup leaders before him, he has repeatedly referred to corruption as a disease of electoral politicians and proposed bureaucratic control as the answer of this conundrum, focusing exclusively on the moral and electoral component of corruption, while silencing any critique of policy-based corruption carried out by his government. Military government are famous for corruption, and of course they're doing all sorts of these other things. But he keeps saying, "Well, this is not corruption. Corruption is the moral corruption. It's not this other type of policy-based corruption." In one of his televised speeches in August 2015, Prayut declared, "Many people still try to destabilize the situation in the country by using the word democracy and election. These people do not see that an incomplete democracy is not safe. The distribution of revenue is unjust, while corruption and wrongful activity are encouraged. And the public will be told that these things are good, righteous, and beneficial to them. Many of Prayut's speeches reveal his view of democratically elected government as corrupt parliamentarian dictatorship, a phrase very dear to historical fascism. In June 2014, he said, "We understand that we're living in a democratic world, but we must also examine ourselves to see how Thailand can be resilient in the face of the many challenges that democracy brings. Parliamentarian dictatorship has to be removed." End quote. On the whole, this new ideological apparatus proposed by the junta revolved around this idea of electoral democracy as a challenge rather than a solution, a risk both to the royal institution and to anti-corruption forces, something that needs to be controlled and limited through a reform administration rather than fostered and protected through more participative processes. So this myth, or this kind of cloud of myth, constantly reiterated in middle-class discourses and conversation oriented in 2019 election. At the eve of the vote, the new king of Thailand, Vajiralongkorn, the son of Bhumipol, went on TV and declared that his subject need to support, and I quote here, goodness, so that good people govern the country and restrain bad people from having power in order to create confusion. End quote. So this idea of the good people, the coming together of the ultra-royalism, anti-corruption, and moral governance, I think is the central mythological machine in Yesi's sense of contemporary Thai authoritarianism. And we can, if you have curiosity, I can talk a little bit more about how kind of cosmologically, in a way, is organized. It offers a ready-made conceptualization that provides a respite from the work of interpreting the present by bringing together a specific Buddhist moralist tradition with culturalist idea of the specificity of the Thai context, this idea of the Thai-style monarchy, and class hatred that elevate the elite and urban middle class to custodian of Thai politics and morality, acting on behalf of the ignorant masses that are deemed ill-prepared to participate in democracy. So we might be thousands of kilometers away and most a century after, but it's hard to deny that here we're not far off Mussolini's famous declaration that, and I quote here, "Fascism denied that the majority, through the mere act of being a majority, can rule human societies." End quote. Okay, so to conclude, let me first recapitulate a bit what we've covered so far. I started by posing a basic question about how to make sense of a resurgence of authoritarianism in contemporary Thailand and its wide support among middle classes. From there, I tried to show that looking back to study of historical fascism can help us adopt some of those travel routes to develop our analysis of contemporary Thai authoritarianism. Three paths I think have directed my analysis. First, a tradition, often forgotten in the study of European fascism, that situates the origin of fascism, its tool, racialized discourse, and technique of oppression inside the colonial project. Secondly, a Gramscian analysis that directs attention to this emergent crisis and conjunctural analysis of historical blocks. And thirdly, an attention argued by Furio Yesi to the mythological machine that provides the wind to the sails of fascism. Learning from them, I then analyzed how Thai middle classes shifted over the last 15 years and explore what shape this new authoritarian hegemony is taking. From this analysis, I believe we can infer two different conclusions, one minimalist and the other maximalist, which I will leave you to evaluate. The minimalist conclusion is that whether or not we label specific contemporary form of authoritarianism as fascist, we can use existing investigation of historical fascism to learn and pick up specific methods of analysis and approaches to contemporary authoritarianism. So this is not to say that these are fascist movements necessarily, but rather that the historiography of fascism can provide an invaluable wealth of thought, concepts, and debate that can help us direct our analysis of contemporary authoritarianism. The maximalist conclusion, instead, will go a step forward and see in contemporary authoritarianism a full-fledged fascist regime. Of course, as I mentioned before, There are a number of scholars who have tried to distill this general characteristic of fascism and use those as a test to assess specific contemporary movement. All of them, not all of them, of course, agree on the criteria, but for this conclusion and this potential option, I will use Walden-Bello criteria and leave it to you to think back to the Thai case and assess the correspondence. I choose Walden-Bello because he's a politologist from the Philippines and a Southeast Asian activist, so it's someone who knows the context but also has been thinking about Duterte and fascism. So, Bello has been arguing for adopting the term fascism to understand the global rise of authoritarianism and proposed 5 main elements to do that. First, he argues that fascists, for him, show disdain and hatred for democratic procedure. Secondly, they tolerate and promote violence. Third, they have heated mad bases to support their anti-democratic thinking and behavior. Fourth, they scapegoat and support the persecution of certain social group. And finally, they're led by a charismatic individual who exhibit and normalize all of the above. I leave it to you to judge if the case I presented fit into those, but I thank you for your time and I look forward to questions.